Without further ado, I do want to hand it and get our show started here. So, Dr. Lieberman, I am going to hand it off to you to introduce our guest speaker today, Daniel Adams. And so, Dr. Lieberman, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Joe, also for the announcement. I encourage students always to go for awards and any kind of scholarship opportunities. A lot of those things are left on the table, and they're really worthwhile pursuing those. And so I am extremely happy to welcome Dan Adams to our lecture series. This is the final lecture, so I hope it acts as inspiration, a kind of mental creative break from your crunching for studio right now. Dan Adams is a founding partner along with Marie Law Adams of Landing Studio in Somerville, Massachusetts. That's right next to Boston, where they focus on designing the intersection of infrastructural and industrial environments and the urban public realm. This work has resulted in awarded designs of Salt Dock Public Parks, a Department of Public Works public park, under highway public spaces, Salt Dock Theater, a Salt Dock COVID food hub, as well as installations, buildings, and events, and operations and maintenance agreements. So Dan is the director also of the School of Architecture at Northeastern University in Boston, based, I would say, on the kind of excellence of the work that he has done with Landing Studio. And he's a graduate of Harvard University and University of Michigan. I think one of the really interesting things about Dan's contribution to this semester's theme, the role of technology in architecture, is that it is a different take on technology. So it's sort of a way of expanding as well as kind of focusing our understanding of what that can mean in architecture. And he and his partner, Marie, really have redefined like what an architectural practice can be and what kinds of questions that architecture can address. So with that, welcome, Dan Adams.
Well, thanks so much for having me, virtually. Obviously, I wish I could be there in person to visit you all, visit your campus, but I'm really delighted to share this work. I'll just share my screen here. Is this coming through, Vonda? Great. So as Vonda said, it's really a very sort of luxurious opportunity for me to think about our work in a slightly different way, maybe than we normally do. I kind of gave it this goofy title, technology, mainly because it had just never occurred to me that the word ecology actually sits right in the word technology. I don't know why I had never noticed that before, but when I was thinking about the lecture, it had dawned upon me, and I don't normally go with these, I don't know, goofy kind of titles, but it just, maybe it'll make sense in a minute. And I guess my appreciation for being able to just think about the work in this way is this notion of productive frictions, which is a really, it's a sort of critical part of how we approach our practice, which is to really think about kind of where does new urban space and urban design come from. I should say my sort of partner in this work is Marie Law Adams. We are partners in work and in life, and we founded our practice back in 2005 and have been trying to really focus on the implementation of new forms of industrial relationship in cities, which is where this notion of productive frictions come from. For me, in the context of this lecture and this talk, I think the productive frictions is really in the notion of sort of challenging our work to think about it through this technological lens and maybe think about our work in slightly new ways, which is a luxurious opportunity for us. The picture on the screen right now is one I love a lot. We do a lot of our work through photography, so I'll have a lot of slides, a lot of images. I'll try and move through them quickly. But I love this moment. This is the moment where nature becomes industry, which is, I think, a really sort of strange phenomenon in our economy and politics. This is essentially a salt production facility. I'm going to situate my work in sort of two parts today. First, talking about sort of the inheritance of some sensibilities, and then talking about some projects, sort of technological sensibilities. And we've kind of, of recent, I guess, really just been thinking a lot. There's obviously a lot of discourse today in urban design and architecture on notions of ecology, which is really a question of less like what is architecture and a little bit more of what does architecture do. And just, I think, two sort of context for this. I don't know why they both talk about numbers of ecologies, but it's kind of interesting. Rainer Banham in his 4 ecologies of Los Angeles, he really dives into something like surfing and just questions like, where does something like surfing as like an urban phenomenon even come from? And what a weird amalgamation of natural systems and, foam boards and the technologies of compressed foam and transportation systems like the rail versus urbanization strategies like the sort of California coastline, commercial street boulevard phenomenon, all gives rise to a whole designed culture that's very much designed through an interrelationship of seemingly isolated designs, but coalesce into something as sort of beautiful and interesting as surfing. And then I like to juxtapose that against like Guattari and his 3 ecologies, not 4, of the kind of different layers through which architects change space and sort of craft and ask this question, what does architecture do? So the 3 ecologies are commonly defined, or I sort of simplify them. Guattari is a little hard to read, but of environmental, the question of how does maybe one biology relate to another biology, sort of classic ecology, like how does a squirrel relate to a tree? Social, which is this sort of strange concept that architecture really shapes how people relate to each other in profound ways. Mental, which is the kind of idea that architects shape the way people think about the world, and the fact that that mental ecology can be radically different than, let's say, actual environmental relationships. So if Vonda and I are having a conversation, obviously what's going on in her head can be radically different than what's going on in my head. And architecture similarly can shape those different perceptions, which are equally structuring of the world as any sort of physical artifact we create. And then I've added here, just because as I was laying out the presentation, it came to my mind, this kind of concept of a legal ecology, which is, I think, the kind of increasingly radical divergence between the kind of regulatory domains that exist and the actual domains that we participate in, and how architecture actually works between those. So be it through zoning or regulations or laws versus what's actually going on the ground, and the kind of reciprocation between those 2 worlds. So those are a couple sensibilities that I want to kind of rip through here to then set up some of our projects. And I should say, so a lot of, I guess, where we launched our firm was coincidental with a really nice fellowship that we got, where we got to kind of travel to a lot of places in the world, looking at the specific the salt industry in the world. And there's a lot of reasons we were looking at salt. It's a really interesting kind of moment where, like I said, nature becomes industry. And what a strange sort of boundary of watching how people can manipulate nature to, economic, political, social, cultural gain. And I guess we were really, I don't know that we even set out for this, but I think we learned a lot of architectural lessons in that process of studying these facilities around the world. So I'm going to share some of those lessons and then maybe translate them to some of our projects. And along the way, talk about some of the technologies that we've sort of identified. So this facility, I think, is really quite remarkable. This is in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And what you're seeing here is, an architecture of the landscape for essentially producing salt through intensifying evaporation, right? And so what the process is it's just really humans sort of riding the wind of time and the evaporation of a great ocean, the Bonneville Ocean, which maybe it could be described as a massive lake, which was primarily in Utah, and is now famous as being a series of salt flats that's still in a, multi-millennia period of evaporation. And what we as people are essentially doing is just like tapping that geologic process to kind of speed it up a little bit to our industrial and economic goals. And when we visited, I think what was just really remarkable was talking to people like on the ground. And, this guy, the pond tender, was talking about, I like birds. That's why I like my job, nothing to do with salt. And you start talking and you realize, oh, wow, this is a pretty intense operation here, because you're producing salt, but you're also producing, in this case, what you're seeing is brine eggs, which are the eggs of a type of fly, which once basically you create this ecosystem where you're creating this intense sort of salt brine that attracts certain species, in this case a fly, and then those flies actually, you know, hatch and attract all sorts of birds across the country, to the point that it's well documented that bird migration patterns have moved across the country to converge at this location, these industrial production facilities, because of that intensification of nature, right? And so you realize that sort of architecture, again, not so much like what it is, but what it does in this case, like just the sort of simple technology of speeding up the evaporation rate of water shifts bird migration patterns. What an amazing environmental ecology. And, you know, when you zoom in, so that's at one scale, that's at maybe the global scale of birds moving across Earth. You sort of zoom in at another scale, and here you see the kind of salt crystals itself, which humans are kind of intensifying, growing faster and faster. And salt growth, there's this beautiful geometry that forms called the spiral dislocation, which is how crystals grow into these sort of perfect cubic crystals. And of course, this is like a specific climate on Earth. So in American economics and politics, this is the location of the Golden Spike National Monument, where the two railroads were brought together in many ways to harvest these industrial resources. We built all these kind of architectures like jetties, primarily to capture petroleum in the Great Salt Lake, because often where you find salt, you find petroleum deeper down. And, you know, amazingly, what you see is like designers, and this was just like a really inspirational piece for us in this way. This is Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, you know, taking all those considerations, the jetty, the rocks, the turning radius of the truck, the kind of chemistry of the water. And he was really intrigued at how this kind of spiral geometry could, you know, change the stagnation of the water to actually create the red algae, the more stagnant the water gets, the more red the water gets, this sort of symmetry between the chemistry of that water and human biology, particularly blood. And I think what was so powerful about that design to us to think about was all the ways that a very simple architectural construct, in this case, the spiral, could have all these kind of environmental impacts. So just like the salt facilities, it's literally moving birds, it's moving flies, and yet have all these kind of cultural references and be derived from all of these, like, let's say, embedded environmental principles to ultimately lead to the technology of the spiral that sort of, you know, is simultaneously a design about molecular structure, salt growth, evaporating oceans, flies, and birds, right? So it's like, are you designing a spiral, or are you designing bird migration and flies? Which from an environmental ecology question was super interesting. And, you know, Smithson in some ways, you know, I won't say ignored some of the other parameters. He touches on them in different ways, but, you know, you even zoom out, I think it's more radical than even what he wrote about when you step back and be like, wow, those salt production facilities, what are they really making? That entire system, that entire bird migration movement, for example, is to produce pool softening salts that are salt exclusively distributed through Walmart. So this is a Walmart, you know, pool softening production system that is creating this environmental ecology. So it makes us really think about the kind of social implications of these ecological systems. And, you know, a different place that we were looking at, this is Ile de Ré, France. It's a very low-lying island environment, quite sort of beautiful, I guess you could say, in terms of the character and this whole kind of constructed canal system. And the sort of social ecology here, this is Marina Abramovich project, one of our early projects I just always loved, just because of the kind of almost comedic quality of this, of you can see how architecture so dramatically has the potential of influencing social relationships, good, bad, awkward, where people are literally forced to squeeze through these naked people passing through a doorway, and the kind of relationship of architecture to that space. Or, you know, Hertzberger's lessons for students of architecture and the ability of architecture to shape social relationships, right? Quite physically. And I guess what Ile de Ré, and then I'll show another site in a minute, sort of taught us was how these seemingly benign, and this is another reason we were studying salt is so neutral. It's so cheap. It's so everyday. It's like talking about the air. Salt is literally everywhere on Earth. It costs almost nothing. I can just like walk out to the beach and get some salt if I want it. So it itself is almost nothing in our systems because it is so ubiquitous and it's so common. It's literally in my blood. It's in the ocean water. It's one of the most abundant minerals on Earth. And so why we were studying salt was it was almost like a way to study a global neutral. Like, oh, and you could really study a place by studying salt because salt's almost irrelevant. So it just reveals all these aspects of a place. So in Ile de Ré, what was so interesting, you see this low-lying island, off the coast of France. And they've essentially calibrated, like agriculture in the US, they've essentially calibrated the island to be a salt production machine. So the whole like island performs in this production of salt. Simply, it's a mixture of the kind of clay-based sediments and this beautiful product called the fleur de sel, which you'll sometimes find in very like high-end restaurant, which is basically the flour of salt. That is, the water evaporates, the salt grows. And you have these people called sauniers who rake the salt off the surface through these sort of delicate ponds where the ponds evaporate with wind and sun. And I think from a sort of technological perspective, the thing I found so sort of amazing about this was just the sheer simplicity by which this entire industrial machine was operating, where when you want to like really move water fast through the system, you pull out that whole shake. But when you want to really calibrate it to sort of small flow, you just pull out the cork, right? And then otherwise, like that degree of I guess, minimal precision. We often call this sort of an elegant detail, how like one small design detail can manifest and regulate a huge network. And in this case, an entire sort of production and cultural product. So what you see here is like this whole image, this organic quality, this like zero petroleum input, the produce, coming from France and this beautiful landscape, coupled with the image of this, this sort of beautiful imagery of the guy raking the salt, becomes this cultural icon, this sort of brand. The Saunier, right, is on all the package of the fleur de sel product, which is sold at exorbitant prices, around the world because the sort of embedded cultural and social value that this ecology creates. And so you see here, this cost €5.50 back in the day. I mean, just to be honest, I can buy a ton of salt from our industrial mines, 2,000 pounds I can buy for less than that. But what you're, of course, buying here is sort of a social cultural value to the point that people travel there to even participate in the process, right? And then it's amazing because you take that exact same process and you recontextualize that, in this case, in the salt flats of Mumbai, where they use the exact same kind of calibration system, very similar kind of clay-based dike systems. In some ways, a more radically dynamic, in this case, nomadic family units that are moving through. This is actually now at Sambahara Lake in Rajasthan, to produce essentially an identical product that then has an entirely different cultural meaning and cultural valuation. In this case, these facilities are producing government rations, which are issued out by the government to ensure sort of nutrition delivered to the citizens. So it's sort of part of a public sector. You can see public sector for serving the nation. So amazingly, you start to see how the kind of consistent architecture, consistent technology becomes entirely socially and culturally situated, and radically different, though identical, between these two environments. And in the end, inherits entirely different sort of cultural significance to those communities. A form, again, of social ecology. So moving on to the mental ecology, as sort of an archetype we focus on a lot, the ideal X is this sort of amazing ship. Post-World War II, you had all these T2 tankers that were left over. And, the famed story is a New Jersey truck driver had this sort of realization like, wow, how inconvenient and laborious and human in a way, how humanly flawed it was to engage people in moving goods from trucks onto ships. Like, he kind of looked at it and it was like, wow, what's really slows this down from an efficiency perspective is people. Because people, they drop stuff, they make mistakes, they ask questions, they wonder why we're shipping, food from our poor, impoverished country to a wealthy country. Why are we doing that? So people are kind of like in the way and they slow things down. And so a pretty, revolutionary technology at the time was the invention of containerization, which really on the screen here shifted, the relationship of people to goods to a broken relationship, right? Where most of us today have very little knowledge about our participation with our material footprint. We kind of don't know where our stuff comes from. We certainly don't know who was involved with making it. We don't know who produced it, and we don't know what its impacts on the environment were because we're disassociated. And those are not unintentional designs. Like, it was very intentional to design containerization to eliminate people from the process, right? And so that goods can kind of just move around the world relatively unimpeded and sort of unknown. And sort of the architectural ramification or reflection of this are, buildings like this. This was when I was studying at this exact same time, and obviously I just thought it was amazing. It was like the same color of a lot of the world's shipping containers today. But this is in Chelsea, Massachusetts, where we do a lot of work. And it was like this famous, it was like a crazy moment when I was in grad school where, it was discovered that a shipping container full of nuclear waste for weapons production was just like misplaced in this warehouse for a couple months in Chelsea, Massachusetts. And no one knew it, right? It was just sitting in a shipping container inside this kind of building. And then you look at most ports and you sort of see that kind of architecture, right? Like a disassociation of people from their environment. And this for us is really, I think, going back to Guattari's concept, like, how is it that architects participate in constructing shared perception of an environment, right? So I guess the ecologies we've talked about, right, and these kind of the associated technologies are, how does architecture shape environments, and what are the kind of impacts of architecture on the environment? How does it shape social relationships and build culture in a place? And then how does it actually build perception in an environment? And what's the responsibility of architecture to, let's say, even be kind of honest versus in some ways construct a shared misconception of the environment? So transitioning now a little bit into our own work. At the same time that we were studying salt facilities, we were sort of pretty deeply involved with designing them. And another aspect of salt that we just found kind of interesting, it almost is a little bit of a historic model of industry still in the United States, where salt facilities sort of sit there. They're not hidden away in these sort of sheds and warehouses. They're open to kind of public perception for good and bad, right? But by being open to perception, they're open to critique, evaluation, consideration, social ecologies, and mental ecologies. So here you're seeing the kind of global convergence, right? Where global resources like the Atacama Desert here, which is essentially where they're mining an evaporated ocean in the Atacama Desert, is connected, in this case, to Boston, Massachusetts, where I'm located. Or another facility in Northern Ireland, right, where underground, different ocean. This is an ocean that predates the Atlantic and the Pacific, called the Zechton Sea, evaporated about 250 million years ago, as the Atlantic and Pacific someday will. And we are mining that between Ireland and Poland to, again, extract materials which are brought, in this case, and this is where I guess the hints for me of things like legal, and I'm calling it legal ecology, I guess it could be called a regulatory ecology, start to come in, right? Like, what are the structures on Earth from a jurisdictional and a bit of economic characteristics start shaping the kind of architecture of the world? In this case, how can it be that mining so deep underground is efficient and logical? Well, in many ways, it's just the sheer expedience of crossing the Atlantic Ocean and not needing to go through the Panama Canal from something like Chile or Australia. And the sheer, at the time, this is now pretty outdated information, 10 years old already, but the sheer like savings of passing through the Panama Canal toll is sort of, let's say, offsets the cost of mining underground. And so you start to have this sort of whole economic ecology on Earth. So in Chelsea, Massachusetts, where we're working, right, the kind of ramifications of that are, that on a summer day, you look down your street and it might look like this. And if a shipment comes from Mexico of recently evaporated salt, it sort of looks like this. And then if Chilean salt comes, it looks like this. And if Northern Irish salt comes, it looks like this. And the city is situated in this kind of global performance, right? And people participate in that. So in some ways, the salt is put into the ecology of the city. This is actually Staten Island, where it's another similar facility, just like a bus stop. And people in the community react to it in different ways. Some, this is someone who lives across in Boston Harbor, who keeps a running blog and, website of the kind of operations of the salt pile. And of course, others are sort of protesting the salt pile. And the salt, enters this sort of cultural context, this social context, right, of a city, in this case, a pretty severe environmental justice community that's very dense. It's about 50% residential and 50% industrially zoned, and it's the most dense residential municipality in Massachusetts, 5th densest in the United States, only following territories of the Bronx in New York City. And in this context of sort of mental ecologies and kind of how we in some ways see our work, I love the work of Joan Nassauer, is someone who's, I think, inspirational in sort of a weird way for us. She does these really comedic and kind of great studies of how very small changes in the built environment can aggregate, amplify to significant like ecological transformation. So for example, she's been questioning for a while now, like what's the obsession in the United States with the American lawn, which is a known problematic ecosystem. It's very monocultural, petroleum intensive, fertilizer, chemicals intensive. It supports almost no habitat and ecology. And yet it's the kind of predominant landscape of essentially suburban and metropolitan environments. And interestingly, so many efforts to, let's say, do anything other, like to sort of naturalize landscapes through meadow plantings or forest strategies, are often undone by people just saying, well, I don't like it. It looks weedy. It looks out of control. It hurts my property values, right? And it's a complete mental construct, right? Because those things are beautiful and they're flowers and they support habitat. And so she does all these studies of essentially what is the tipping point by which, people are comfortable with the image on the left. Like, yep, I like that. That looks good. They're not comfortable maybe with the image all the way on the right, 75% native, but actually somewhere in the middle, the introduction. And so what she's been doing are a lot of cognitive surveys to essentially assess those kind of like relationships between human cognition and perception with environmental principle on the ground. So the first projects that we undertook actually when we were still students was to sort of insert designs into some of these ecosystems, maybe a little bit even kind of like naively, right? And we were working a lot with light and large scale light installations. At the time, kind of an ecology and technology that was coming into Chelsea, Massachusetts there was a lot of tax incentives for the movie industry. They were trying to build jobs in the movie sector by attracting film industry to Boston. So we had this like sort of quick arrival of a lot of people who did, essentially film support for like lighting, recording, etc. And so we met some of those people and tapped into those networks. A lot of them were actually living in Chelsea, Massachusetts at the time, to essentially use their materials to do these pretty informally set up installations, low cost, to essentially start just projecting like very everyday statements onto the salt piles, right? So in this case, like Christmas carols, like let it snow. And the light had a really beautiful interaction with the salt because of course the salt would come and go and get carved away, and the light sort of adapted to that. And we could really start sort of transforming that environment, right? And the text, the sort of projected statements sort of interacted with that. And it opened up sort of new dialogues. I should say at this time, this is pre-2005, there's a lot of questioning about why do cities have industry? Shouldn't they just all be gone? Wouldn't the cities be better off if we built sort of condominiums here on the waterfront, high value condominiums? And so industry was often sort of painted in that kind of a negative light. And yet I think people also realized their kind of dependence on it. I think one of our theses or theories is that simply moving industries sort of out of sight, out of mind actually tends to dislocate and divorce them from our kind of regulatory context. So, you know, you put an industry way out there, well, then you can just forget about it. And to be honest, it can get really kind of unregulated and pretty nasty. Wherein an industry may not be, in the case of salt, a health hazard or a great negative impact, maybe we need to think of how we actually negotiate our own industrial footprint and keep it as part of our perception so that it's regulated by the natural kind of productive frictions of urban environments. And so the sort of salt in this case was brought into sort of greater dialogue with the community through these types of installations. Again, for like good, you know, positive, and for critique. And that set off for us a whole series of sort of like almost operations to rethink that kind of relationship, that ecology of both the environmental, social, mental, and legal relationships between industry and communities. So it started with like light projections, and we started really digging into sort of events, and again, translating those technologies of like lighting to sort of remake the landscape. And how could these environments be open to the public? And could we start translating the kind of tools and ingredients of industry into public space? In this case, this is a series of film and performance art festivals that we designed and kind of installed in New York City at salt facilities. And, you know, very quickly when, you know, you're working in one ingredient, in this case, light, and there are tools, you start working with other ingredients like the salt itself and figuring out even techniques of how do you work with the laborers on the dock to actually construct like architectures out of the salt. So you're seeing some of the, what we call the salt galleries, right? Where those environments can sort of be built to then support the various art installations and become essentially like a festival ground. And it was, I think, really exciting to us again here to see how actually a material that in most contexts is kind of bemoaned and in some ways disliked as sort of an industrial necessary evil could start to become a sort of new ingredient in the city. And artists are obviously sort of great for reconceptualizing things in that way. So you see here all the different kind of archetypes of galleries that were designed and installed, and all the different material properties of the salt that were capitalized on it, be it, you know, the relatively benign characteristics of it to like your skin and your body and your biology, to, you know, its structurally supportive characteristics, to its reflective characteristics. And I think what we even started seeing is then even the kind of casting of the industrial landscape into new light. I think it's even funny in this photograph here, right? Like all the people aren't looking at the artwork. They're looking out into the industrial waterfront, right? And connecting to a landscape and a series of systems that they have been really quite dislocated from. And some of the nicest moments in the event were actually as things would be wrapping up, people, you know, would almost follow the artist's lead and just start to kind of reconsume the industrial landscape. So here you see people kind of just climbing on the piles, hanging out. It even like cracked us up that we would light up equipment just so people wouldn't walk into it at night. And people thought that was part of the artwork, right? And so they'd take selfies and hanging out with the kind of industrial equipment. And you see art pieces like this, and even the process, this one small child like destroyed that entire art piece when it was done and had, you know, a great time. And the specific technologies of that, or even how we specify the specific salts, you know, salt takes on really different kind of character if it's evaporated versus it's blasted out of the ground. So evaporated salt is really soft and tactile like snow to the touch. And so for us, this is like a rolling process. And I think when Vanda said it's a little bit of a way we work or a new model of practice, we often refer to this a bit as like an architect in residence almost, is that we kind of, I guess, just like this is a client, a company, you know, that we've been working with since 2004. And it's really afforded us the nice opportunity to just kind of keep adding to that palette. And I think in ecological architecture, that's a fairly vital way of working, because it's not about creating a one-off project that serves a singular purpose. It's really about designing the relationship of industry and infrastructure over time which is, I think, a fundamental question in sustainability today. That is a flawed aspect of architecture as a discipline, is the kind of one and done contract model. If what we're trying to achieve is sort of long-term sustainability, well, in many ways, we need to form long-standing relationships with projects and places. So it's a bit of a divergence from maybe the global architect model to a very local architect model of sort of engaging with a place consistently over time, bringing kind of creativity to the operations of those systems. So sort of continuing in Chelsea, like I think what you see from lighting to festivals, it really started asking us like, well, how do we create more kind of permanent access for people into these environments? How can we kind of break down these industrial barriers? And you start looking at, well, what are the systems, the kind of ecologies, you could even call it technologies that prevent. So in 2001, after 9/11, there was the enforcement by Homeland Security of transportation worker identification credentials, which really created a lot of security sort of prohibitions on access into industrial facilities. So a typical like security perimeter of a terminal like this would be the entire terminal. You can't enter. That's like the default in Homeland Security, even though these are public resources and public goods. And so some of the technologies, I suppose, that we work with aren't so much, let's say, mechanical innovations or material innovations, but are often these kind of legislative and legal kind of innovations where, you know, you sit down with Coast Guard officials and Homeland Security and actually try and drill into the regulations, you know, like, so if this is sort of the default social condition, like entire terminal not accessible, well, what are the actual regulations? And is there a way to reevaluate those to sort of have a new technology of security provisions? And what it really comes down to is they just needed to see the gangways and the ship lines, because to be honest, they're trying to regulate who's coming in off the ships. That's it. The salt is not a concern, which there's a lot of social issues. We can talk about that in terms of like stowaways on ships and why that happens, and maybe why as a global community we could be a little more accepting of that. On the other hand, in this context, what it really meant was that the security perimeter could essentially be the gangway and view cones to ship lines, right? So instead of the entire terminal being a security zone, something like a little shed like this, and that little window there is actually the security requirement. And what that opens up is the ability to kind of break down those boundaries, right? So this for us is where those like elegant details come in, like from Ile de Ré and the wooden shake and the cork. In this case, it's not a wooden shake and a cork. It's literally a plan drawing, which could be used with the U.S. Army or the U.S. Coast Guard and the Homeland Security to essentially argue for achievement of security parameters through a drawing. So that's the kind of technology here. And what it unleashes is the ability that, you know, we can have youth groups come to the dock. We can have high school dances come to the dock. And we can even create things like public access landscapes like parks on the dock. So this was a project to transform a former asphalt batching terminal into a salt dock and public access landscape. It was a project where we recycled a lot of the tank farm. You can see here we're demolishing the asphalt tank farm and then designing a shared use landscape between the sort of salt operations headquarters, the stockpiling operations, obviously ship mooring, and then how we could repurpose these structures to become the kind of public access landscapes. Some of the specific kind of technologies within this designed ecology is you know, tapping into something like the seasonality of the salt. The salt's really used in the winter. It's not really used in the summer. That's almost a nice mirror of what happens for public space in Boston, where public spaces are used in the summer and not so much in the winter because of the climate. So like Chelsea, Massachusetts, despite its density, it didn't have like a single point of access to its own waterfront. Certainly didn't have basketball courts on the waterfront. You know, so could we essentially design a seasonal shared use of the landscape where in the winter it's used for salt, in the summer it's used for basketball and event space? In that case, the kind of technologies of that, this is the sensibility, I guess, taken from like Ile de Ré, are very like simple, right? You know, like how do you design a mobile fence that can just be kind of repositioned around? Using their kind of standard industrial products. And how do you make arguments? This gets into the kind of legal ecology, right? About how do you make arguments to political jurisdictions that normally prohibit public access in the waterfront? How can you create arguments that actually these public spaces are still serving industrial good and industrial productivity? Which is, again, where in many ways the technology for us resides in the domain of drawings, which become what we call sort of legal and politically operative drawings, right? To kind of reposition and recharacterize something through how we define it in drawings. So this is not something that we can call a park. This is what's called an industrial public access area. Something like this waterfront is still designed to serve ship mooring. You can't see it here, but there's a ship bollard. And the kind of documentation that makes this possible is like legal agreements that we help negotiate as architects. In this case, memorandum of agreement, which are contracts, right? Which on one hand, you create sort of visual drawings like this, and on the other, kind of written contracts like this that structure those relationships. And I suppose that, you know, really identifies this notion of the kind of legal ecology and the associated technologies of that, right? Is that law and regulations have a really sort of reciprocal relationship with architecture, in that for the built environment, you can't write policy and law about things you don't know you can build, and you can't build things that are illegal, right? So there's always sort of a chicken and egg dance between law and politics about how do you create sort of case precedents in architecture that can shift regulations of communities. Because prior to this document, actually creating public access in such terminals was prohibited. So the MOU, these drawings, become those kind of technological devices that crack that relationship between policy, law, and design. You know, other aspects of the MOU in that case were, you know, coming to relationships with the city about how to stockpile the salt to preserve views and to open things like basketball courts and recreation. The kind of ecological relationships that were embedded in the design are things like trying to even think about how we work with the local labor force, in this case, the workers of the salt dock, to essentially design the landscapes in ways that could be built by those workers. I think these were lessons we had learned from doing things like the film festivals and working with the workers to actually build those festivals. So in this case here, you can see they're very good at building piles. So we're building landscapes out of piles. And what's amazing, I think, about designing in that way, in this kind of, let's say, developing technologies that are intrinsic to the systems of that landscape, and embedding them within the ecological relationships of, in this case, an industry and a city, inevitably propagates sort of new relationships. So that, you know, as part of that park, we designed a former oil tank to become a theater space. So then the local theater groups started using that space. That inevitably leads to new relationships where things like salt stages can become part of the theatrical performances. This is sort of Hamlet on the salt pile. Or, for example, grave scenes on the salt pile. And now these are all kind of co-built projects between the city theater groups and the industry. This involved a local timber reclamation contractor to help build this Midsummer Night's Dream stage set. And then that leads to sort of further events that we design and we help sort of negotiate between the industry and the community. In this case, these are sort of charity events. Those charity events have like led to sort of maybe new installations, right? What I'm calling these sort of technologies of socio-spatial practice, in this case, electric infrastructure. And I mean, I think I'm going to close on just this last piece, right? That in that kind of, let's call this a socio-spatial technology coming out of the ecological relationship between city and industry, which was essentially a profound amount of electrical service to support theater and events in the park. when COVID hit, for example, the city was desperate to find places to set up food distribution hubs. The big limitation for them was how to set up refrigeration technology to keep the food from perishing so they could get it distributed to people. They needed places with like ready power and sort of truck capacities. And amazingly, the sort of infrastructure that we had put in place for the theater, coupled with the kind of sort of industrial know-how, led to the ability of this property to take on a whole sort of new role in the community. Again, the kind of elegant detail of something that maybe on one hand is very overlookable, which is sort of publicly accessible, voltage, becoming sort of a great public service to the community. So with that, Vonda, I'm going to stop because I know I've hit like 45 minutes here, and I want to make sure I leave some time for conversation. But thank you for this chance to share some of our research and work.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for such an interesting presentation. I was wondering, do you have an image that shows, is this how this space was set up post-COVID to store and distribute food to the population?
Yeah, that's, I mean, it was, it's kind of one of those remarkable things where on one hand, you're very like proud because your design is serving a community in a completely new way. And it was a very, let's say, rapid exercise. We had about 1 week to get this set up, and it, since last April, has been serving about 10,000 people a week with food. Which is a significant portion of people. And it was also, in a way very disheartening to sort of, I guess, discover how sort of tenuous these infrastructure systems were, that in fact, like a salt dock that just sort of happened to have good electric provision would be like the best resource we could come up with in a city for providing food. So we had about like 1 week to get it set up. But I think that was, it's maybe one of the most fascinating lessons of that was just the ability to tap into sort of industrial community ecosystem relationships to quickly get power set up, get containers set up, get tents set up, get refrigerator units set up. Like those kind of relationships were probably more profound than any possible infrastructure system could be to just immediately address a kind of rapid community need.
Well, if you wouldn't mind showing a couple of images of that, I wanted to take the time while you do that, if you can, to mention to everyone who is watching right now that they can either just speak up and ask questions, or they can put a question in the chat space, and I will transmit those questions to Daniel. So we've already got one from Jose Bernal, who says, first of all, that he thinks this repurposing of projects that you guys are doing is absolutely wonderful. That's in quotes. And he wanted to know whether the private owners of the facility with whom were there kind of additional obstacles in convincing people for you to do these kind of unusual projects, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was so this took about 7 years of permitting to build this project, mainly because actually everything about it was like illegal before we undertook it. So, in typical zoning policy, and this is where I mean the kind of legal ecologies and technologies, right? It's kind of an amazing dance. It gets into the weeds here, but state regulation in most states really prioritizes regional environmental benefit, right? So, man, getting goods into a region in a sustainable fashion at the scale of global commerce, right? Getting big ships with tons of cargo into a place. So actually in Boston Harbor, in this portion of Boston Harbor, the only potential use of the waterfront was to serve those industrial uses. It's a rigid regulatory domain. On the other hand, the cities are like, they're environmental justice communities. They're like, we don't want more industry. We got so many trucks, we got so much air pollution. So what we want is just public access or housing on the waterfront. We don't want any more industry. And yet what this site was a former asphalt batching terminal. Asphalt batching is very detrimental to human health. It causes a lot of respiratory disease. And that was the only allowable use of the waterfront owing to its grandfathered status. And so on one hand, the state said it can only be industry. The city said it cannot be industry. It must be something else. So what that led to was like a 7-year kind of negotiation where we had to prove what we would call a less detrimental non-conforming use compared to an asphalt batching terminal to kind of find a negotiation. And what was amazing was there was no model of that in the state. There was no model of like a negotiated compromise of how you could create point public access into an industrial environment. And what's kind of amazing to see is now that there is a model, actually the codes in Massachusetts have changed. So it is pre-scripted now in Massachusetts. We actually had to change state law to do this, that now you can create these kind of co-shared environments, right? Which is really that kind of, so like, it's kind of nuts, right? Because you would think, oh yeah, like as from a technological innovation perspective, you would think, well, of course we need ways to engage industrial operations with local communities. There should be designs for that. But you can't, again, regulate or legislate about things that don't exist. So if you don't have a kind of productive model of it, you can't write a code about it, right? As soon as you do have sort of proof of concept, then you can write code, which then allows this to become sort of a model in other sites. So that was the biggest obstacle, was negotiating that relationship. On one hand, convincing the state that you could have public access, and on the other hand, convincing the city that you could design an industry to be sustainable and good performing for sort of its local context.
I think that's really fascinating. I mean, your whole talk could actually be sort of told through the framework of, as you were calling it, legal ecologies, but we could call them legal technologies in a way too, because all the kind of bureaucratic administrative systems and organizations that we have are considered in many areas a type of technology, right? The sort of bureaucracy. I want to make sure that maybe the co-hosts, Jeff Huber or Daniel or anybody else who is on, and certainly any students would like, if they have any questions that they would pose to you, please, I invite you to do that. For some reason in the virtual world, the kind of response to an invitation like that takes a little bit longer.
I think I was just going to say it's fantastic work. You know, it's fantastic work, and I'm actually excited. Like I always venture into these projects that are verging on what you call illegal. I know when we meet, I'm sure you don't use illegal when you're talking to city commissioners or anything, but they love the word non-conforming. But
yeah.
I love the fact that you're kind of in that realm and working where we don't normally see these kind of public engagement, these public lands used, or at least this kind of way that these MOUs are used to provide access to the water. So no, it's fantastic. Thanks.
No, I appreciate it. Well, and I was going to say, Vaughn, I mean, sorry, I didn't have time to get to it today, but one of the big areas we've been working right now is with highway departments, right? And, in the green infrastructure movement, I'd say one of the big revolutions that's happening there is it used to be that our kind of investments in infrastructure had to be very kind of monocultural, right? Like that, like highway departments can only pay for highways. And we're starting to try and find ways to build like things like parks and public spaces around highways. And what's kind of amazing is like highway departments by federal tax code and policy cannot build parks. They can't spend taxpayer money on like parks. But what they can spend taxpayer money on are things like bike paths, because that's transportation, walking paths, that's transportation. Benches are prerequisites for paths because, particular elderly or anyone who needs to sit down and rest for a second needs a bench. Lights, you got to light a path at night. Green stormwater management, is to filter the water off the highway. And that's like bioswales and beautiful meadow plantings. And so they can't build like parks, but they can build like bike paths and bioretention and meadows and lights and benches. And so you start to realize, wow, just by like redefining something's legal description, like, yeah, bench is an infrastructure for sitting, resting, and human health, and highways can build that. So if you just sort of recharacterize it and kind of rethink its definition, it's like you don't even have to invent anything new. You just need to recharacterize something you already have. That's that kind of legal ecology technology concept, I guess, which we're starting to kind of play around with.
I think what's tremendous about the kind of work that you do is something that you touched on earlier on, which is that You know, a lot of architecture has a kind of object. There is not that much understanding of the local context, whether it's a social or ecological kind of elements. And buildings are designed often for their formal and stylistic properties, but very little is done, you know, post construction to understand how these spaces are inhabited and what happens. And in your case, because these projects are, as you say, illegal, or there's no precedent that exists for them, you have to do so much work with your client, with different agencies, with the neighbors. And so you actually, the projects themselves kind of emerge from this accumulation of knowledge that happens as the designer. So it has a kind of opposite time span and the kind of form that it takes up. We have another question from Jose, who is, and this actually speaks to maybe the regulatory climate of Massachusetts and ports, maybe more generally. He's sort of translating the work that you do, or hypothetically translating it to South Florida, where there are also industrial and port facilities. And he's wondering whether, you know, the work that you do can be done in other places. I mean, you'd have to speculate unless you have actually done this work in other environments and other regulatory. I'm imagining the regulatory component is in some ways what you're speaking to.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I think we're really reckoning with on coastlines, but everywhere, right? I mean, it's really questions of sustainability, and I think that was something that hit me early on in some of this work, right? Like, on one hand, like public access and, let's say, salt marshes along coastlines are about sustainability, right? And then on the other hand, so is like sustainable transportation systems, and like, you know, a ship of salt. Now, albeit we can talk about whether salting roads is a sustainable practice. You know, that's like asking if driving cars is a sustainable practice, right? Is complex, you know, and we can we reflect on that a lot in our work. But for example, you know, if I can't dock a ship, well, then I got to bring 3,000 trucks from Port Newark to get that cargo, right? And so you know, one of the big challenges in this is literally where you get those kind of conflicts, right? Like on the state level, they're like, man, if we lose the ability to bring ships in, we literally are going to be dependent on Port Newark, you know, in a 4-hour drive of trucks to get our goods. Okay, that's a problem. And then the community is like, but, you know, we want salt marshes, we want public space, because that's what's sustainable for our community locally here. All you have to go in is, you know, 10 miles inland, and they're like, no, I want those ships. You know, I don't really care if you got to park on the waterfront. I need my, you know, salt. I need my petrol. So there's this kind of, that's an environmental issue, because both are right. You know, neither is wrong. I mean, it's both are right. It's a environmental conflict. It's obviously a social conflict. It very quickly becomes a political and legal conflict. And so that's, yeah, I always like in architecture the notion of we focus a lot on the kind of the footprint, the question, like, again, not what is architecture, but what does architecture do? Like, in the end of the day, I don't really care what is architecture. It's like, what does it do? You know, how does it change environmental performance? How does it change social relationships between people? And architects, and, you know, how does it change mental understanding, are not necessarily the best at following sort of, let's say, scientific methods of even assessing those impacts. To your point about like post-occupancy surveying, or even I've started working here at Northeastern with like our psychology department. Like, so often architects have these sort of funny statements. They say like, oh, this changed people's perception of X, Y, and Z. And you're like, oh, did it really? Like, how do you know that? You know, did you follow a cognitive surveying process to assess that, or you're just sort of intuiting? So those are some of the things I think we're grappling with as architecture starts reflecting. I mean, I think it was very convenient, you know, I don't know, even 100, 50 years ago, that you could kind of build something and not be accountable for its impacts, accountable on its environmental impacts, accountable for its cultural, social impacts, accountable for its mental impacts. And that's just no longer the case, right? Like, we realize that what we do has so many impacts. So we kind of have to revolutionize the practice to be accountable to the full footprint of what it is that we build. But even being kind of aware of that footprint is, I think, a pretty radical challenge. I mean, whatever. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think your work, but I do think your work is kind of evidence of, I mean, obviously you're doing a different kind of practice, but it's because the unusual nature of your projects kind of forced that on you, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've kind of discovered this or created this new niche of project type, but even more conventional, so-called conventional projects could apply the methods that you use. They could be much more intensive. They're just not forced to typically, right? Not in the same way.
Well, we've had the luxury that depending on types of clients that we have and relationships, like I guess as a model for us, what's pretty cool for us is we have some relationships, for example, with the salt company, or for example, more and more with Department of Transportation in the state. There's sort of ongoing long-term, like you kind of keep figuring it out with them. And then what's nice about that is kind of lessons learned become the kind of cases for maybe more one-off projects. So that kind of model of firm, I mean, I guess I think it's, to be honest, if you look in the history of architecture at the Albert Kahns and the Peter Barons, who had sort of long-term industrial partnerships, I think it's only a fairly, and to be honest, traditionally architects were more locally engaged. Now they've become much more global, which means they're much more detached from the subjects where they're working. Like, I actually think it's a fairly recent phenomenon that architects have such short relationships with environments. I think traditional modes, people worked more locally, they were more situated in their local context, so there was more of a kind of give and take, less of a parachuting in of architecture into an environment. So in some ways, I don't think it's not exactly like innovative on our part. It's almost more just like returning to maybe a more historic model.
There appears to be one more question. It's quite broad, so I don't know if you want to shape it to be a little bit more specific to your practice. But if you can see, Jessica wrote, speaking about human health, what are other ways that architecture can have an influence on human health, including mental health? And I'm going to you've sort of addressed that a little bit. Obviously, mental and physical health can't be separated from probably environmental goods or harms, and that's something you're addressing, but maybe you can speak a little bit to that, and then we'll wrap it up because we are over the hour and I want to be mindful of other people's time.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great and yes, very big question, Jessica. I think I really, for me, I'm sure there's a lot of ways to look at it. I think the kind of footprint concept is a really interesting one, right? It's a challenge to us as designers. It's paralyzing actually as a designer. Like it's absolutely paralyzing if you were responsible for everything you did as an architect, right? Like if you had, and that's my lesson for like from Smithson, for example, right? Like, no, he did not even, not in a single of his documents does he write about birds as a result of spiral jetty, right? He had no conception or thought that, his work would participate in like moving the migration patterns of birds. He was kind of tapping into all sorts of other systems. But like architecture, because it situates itself into an environment, is such like a powerful influence on that environment. And, I think the more I've looked at it, I think, there's like bliss in ignorance, right? And we maybe need a little less bliss because like it's very nice to just sort of make something that, subscribes to your belief system and what you like. And so that notion of accountability and footprint, I think, is the greatest contemporary challenge in architecture today. This is, again, even in the regulatory legal domain. I mean, it's much harder to build a lot of the types of infrastructure and architecture that we even celebrate because it doesn't conform to contemporary. So like, there's like a catching up of physical architecture to even our regulatory domains where we're still using and depending on a lot of outmoded, essentially now illegal, architecture for our sort of day-to-day. But so so when I mention things like, I think it is also figuring out how to work in an interdisciplinary way with a lot of other experts. To your point about like mental health, it's been super interesting, like I said, to start working with like cognitive psychologists. That's why I like that Joan Nassauer. She's at Ohio State, I think, these days. You could look into her work, not because she's looking at mental health specifically, but she's looking at how she's one of the few people I can actually identify who is using proper scientific methods of assessing how physical space influences human perception because I think architects, if we kind of get it, we're starting to figure out things like, yeah, how are architects impact even the climate? We kind of get that. We impact sea level rise. Those are kind of predictable environmental systems. It's what I like about Guattari's observation about, social ecology versus, those are in some ways are the hardest in my mind, like, because they're so unpredictable. People are so hard to understand sometimes. And so social ecology, mental ecology, and Joan's really looking at, how in a very simple way, very simple architecture, can we possibly come up with tools that even gauge how you make a piece of architecture? How does it change the way people feel? Like, how does it change their perception of their environment? Again, I think we often have sloppily kind of worked intuitively on those things without necessarily engaging with the professionals and the discourse that actually knows how to assess those things legit, like for real.
Well, I think this is a great place to end because it's a kind of call to architects to more seriously take a kind of interdisciplinary knowledge that's out there, which they often sort of I would say, are sort of superficially engaged in, but I think there are opportunities here to do much richer work, as your work demonstrates. So I really want to thank you, Daniel, for your presentation and sticking around to answer questions from the audience. And I want to thank everyone for attending today. Really appreciate your hanging in there with the lecture series this year, and good luck in your final projects and exams. So any closing thoughts, Daniel?
I just want to thank Vonda and FAU. Yeah, no, thank you so much. Really happy to sort of get this time with y'all.
Great, it's been our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Hey, see ya.